Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the real origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and no, it's not ancient tribal hatred. The roots of this story run through the decaying corridors of old empires and the dusty hallways of colonial bureaucracy. Let's go back to the Ottoman Empire. For 400 years, from 1517 to 1917, Palestine was under Ottoman rule. But this wasn't the suffocating, centralized dictatorship you might expect. The Ottomans ruled with an imperial structure that allowed a surprising amount of local autonomy. Cities like Jerusalem, Nablus, and Hebron ran themselves through local councils, religious leaders, and community systems. Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities lived side by side, not without tension, but not in open war either. This wasn't paradise, but it wasn't constant chaos either. But then, enter the British, and with them, enter the twist. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed like a house of cards, and Britain swept in to take control of Palestine. They called it a mandate, as if they were caretakers. But this was no neutral babysitting job. The British had their own plans, and they made promises, a lot of them. In 1917, they issued the Balfour Declaration, a short letter with explosive implications. It stated British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But here's the catch: they had already made contradictory promises to the Arab population. Arabs had been encouraged to revolt against the Ottomans during the war with the vague hope of post-war independence. So now you've got two peoples, one land, and two sets of promises, and Britain holding the keys. This contradiction wasn't an accident. It was part of a classic imperial strategy known as divide and rule. Britain had used this tactic across its empire, pitting ethnic or religious groups against one another to maintain control. The more divided the people, the easier they were to govern. So now, under British administration, tensions between Jewish immigrants and the local Arab population began to rise. Immigration surged. Land sales accelerated. Protests broke out. The stage was being set, not by ancient enemies, but by imperial powers managing their colonial chessboard. Let that sink in. This wasn't about age-old hatred. It was about imperial maneuvering, colonial promises, and a rapidly shifting demographic and political landscape. What happens when one empire collapses and another tries to shape the future with contradictory promises? Well, that's where the story really begins. Now we arrive at the year that changed everything, 1948. This is the moment where the slow burn of imperial decisions exploded into war, displacement, and trauma that still echoes through the streets of Gaza and the halls of the United Nations today. Let's start with the UN Partition Plan, officially known as Resolution 181. After World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, there was mounting international pressure to establish a Jewish homeland. So the United Nations proposed dividing British-controlled Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, with the city of Jerusalem set aside under international administration. On paper, this sounded like a compromise. But here's the problem: neither side saw it that way. Jewish leaders accepted the plan. For them, it was an historic opportunity to establish sovereignty. But Arab leaders, both within Palestine and across the region, rejected it outright. From their perspective, the plan handed over a majority of land to a minority of the population, many of whom had recently arrived from Europe. They saw it as a colonial theft of their homeland. So what happened? War. Civil war broke out between Jewish and Arab communities in late 1947, escalating into a full-scale regional war after Israel declared its independence in May of 1948. Neighboring Arab states invaded. The new state of Israel fought back. The result? A decisive Israeli military victory and a devastating humanitarian loss for the Palestinian people. And this brings us to the Nakba, which literally means a catastrophe in Arabic. During and after the war, over 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes. Around 400 villages were destroyed. Entire communities were erased from the map. For Palestinians, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a personal, cultural, and generational wound. A trauma that still lives on in refugee camps, oral histories, and family keys to homes that no longer exist. Meanwhile, Israelis celebrated the birth of their state, a long-awaited return to the land, a miracle of survival and sovereignty after centuries of persecution. And here's the tragic symmetry: what one side saw as liberation, the other saw as ethnic cleansing. This is where the contested narratives truly harden. For Israelis, 1948 is Independence Day. For Palestinians, it is the beginning of exile. Two peoples, one land, and now, two historical realities that can't be easily reconciled. So how do you move forward when your neighbor's national holiday is your personal catastrophe? It's not just about territory anymore. It's about memory, identity, and the right to tell your version of the truth. After the 1948 war, the world map was redrawn, but not with permanent ink. Gaza, in particular, was thrown into a kind of political limbo. Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip, But, and this is key, it didn't make Gaza a part of Egypt. From 1949 to 1967, Gaza was governed by Egypt without granting its people citizenship. Think about that. Over 200,000 Palestinian refugees were now living under Egyptian military administration, but they weren't Egyptian citizens. They couldn't vote. They had no national rights, no path to full inclusion. What kind of future can you build when your existence is suspended in this kind of political no man's land? Economic development? Minimal. Political integration? Denied. The people of Gaza were left to live in camps, navigate an unstable black market economy, and survive under a system that offered neither autonomy nor opportunity. And just as this fragile arrangement became semi-permanent, history came knocking again. Fast forward to 1967. In just 6 days, yes, 6, the map of the region changed dramatically once more. Israel, after launching a preemptive strike, captured Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This became known as the Six-Day War. In Gaza, Israel imposed military governance. Settlements began to appear, borders tightened, and suddenly, Palestinians in Gaza were living under a new occupier. For the second time in just 2 decades, their status changed, but not toward freedom. Meanwhile, refugee numbers swelled. Gaza became one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Jobs were scarce, resources were stretched thin. And here's the economic catch: as borders closed and local industries collapsed, Gaza became increasingly dependent on Israel for basic goods, permits, and services. A cycle of dependency was born, engineered through restricted mobility and unequal access. But dependency doesn't erase resentment, it fuels it. The pressure cooker effect began to build. With political exclusion, economic desperation, and a military presence that never left, the seeds of resistance took root. This was the origin of organized resistance movements, born not just from ideology, but from decades of social strain and stateless existence. So let's be clear, the modern conflict in Gaza didn't begin with rockets or airstrikes. It began with layered systems of control, by multiple powers, over multiple decades, that left an entire population without a state, without freedom, and without an off-ramp. If you're asking, why Gaza? This is where the answer begins. If you want to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can't just zoom in on the map, you have to zoom out. Way out. Because this isn't just a local feud. It's also a geopolitical chessboard. And the fingerprints of global powers, especially the United States, are all over it. Let's start with a simple fact. Since 1967, the United States has been Israel's largest military ally. This alliance isn't just about diplomacy, it's about weapons, funding, and shielding. Billions of dollars in military aid flow from Washington to Tel Aviv every year. We're talking about the most advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, and surveillance technologies, all backed by unwavering diplomatic support. When the United Nations drafts resolutions critical of Israeli policies, especially regarding occupation or military action, it's often the United States that casts the veto. Now, let's talk numbers. Israel receives over $3.8 billion annually in US aid. Compare that to the Palestinian Authority, which receives far less, and what aid it does receive is typically conditional. Conditional on what? On maintaining security cooperation with Israel, which often means policing their own population. So while one side gets advanced weapons with no strings attached, the other gets financial crumbs tied to political obedience. That's not a neutral playing field. That's a weighted scale. And then there's the battlefield of the mind, media and narrative control. Western media often echoes government talking points. When bombs fall on Gaza, headlines read clashes erupt or violence escalates. But rarely do they examine root causes like occupation, blockade, or displacement. The story is often framed as a symmetrical conflict between equals, ignoring the power imbalance and historical context. This framing matters because when public understanding is distorted, accountability disappears. One side becomes the eternal defender, the other, the eternal aggressor, and we can't ignore the geopolitical double standards. Gaza has been called the world's largest open-air prison by human rights groups. Yet despite repeated wars, civilian casualties, and infrastructure collapse, international outrage often fizzles quickly. Why? Because Gaza doesn't fit the strategic interests of powerful allies. When similar humanitarian crises happen in other regions, say, Ukraine, the global response is swift and loud. But when it happens in Gaza, the world shrugs. So what does all this mean? It means that this conflict isn't just about borders or religion. It's also about power projection, military alliances, and the selective attention of the global stage. And when global powers pick favorites, the local cost is measured in lives, not just dollars. By the early 1990s, it seemed like peace might finally be on the horizon. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993, created the Palestinian Authority, a new governing body that many hoped would be the first step toward a two-state solution. There were handshakes on the White House lawn, speeches about reconciliation. A new era was promised. But behind the headlines, trust was eroding fast. On the ground, settlement expansion in the West Bank didn't stop, it accelerated. The daily realities of checkpoints, raids, and arrests continued. The Palestinian Authority, rather than becoming a government of liberation, was increasingly seen by many as a subcontractor for Israeli control. They provided security cooperation but had no real sovereignty. And in this atmosphere of frustration and fading hope, a new force rose to power: Hamas. Founded during the First Intifada, or uprising, Hamas began as a grassroots movement combining Islamic ideology, armed resistance, and social services. Unlike the Palestinian Authority, Hamas positioned itself as uncompromising. No negotiations, no recognition of Israel. Their popularity surged, especially in Gaza, because they filled the vacuum left by decades of failed leadership and empty peace deals. Then came the shock. In 2006, Hamas won democratic elections in Gaza. That's right, despite their hardline stance, they were legally elected. The result? Western governments, including the United States and the European Union, refused to recognize the new government. Sanctions were imposed. Funds were cut off. A power struggle with the Palestinian Authority broke out, turning violent. And within a year, Hamas had taken full control of Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority held the West Bank. Two governments, one people, no sovereignty. Israel, along with Egypt, responded with a blockade. Gaza's borders were sealed, imports restricted, exports strangled. Even basic materials like cement or fuel were often banned or tightly controlled. Israel cited security concerns, particularly the threat of rocket attacks. But the blockade didn't just affect weapons. It crushed the economy, paralyzed the healthcare system, and turned daily life into a slow-motion crisis. The United Nations and human rights groups have called the blockade collective punishment, a tactic that violates international law. But it continues, year after year, and inside Gaza, the people are trapped between two forces. On one side, an authoritarian Hamas government that brooks no dissent, and on the other, a suffocating blockade that turns every act of survival into a political risk. Food, electricity, education, it's all rationed through power and politics. So what happens when you're ruled by one regime and blockaded by another? You get a population with no exit, no faith in elections, no pathway to peace, just walls, physical and psychological. The rise of Hamas wasn't the beginning of extremism, it was the outcome of hopelessness. And the blockade didn't prevent war, it ensured one would always be brewing. War is supposed to be a last resort, a failure of diplomacy, a tragedy for everyone involved. But in Gaza, war has become a cycle, a pattern, a recurring event that returns every few years like clockwork. And the worst part? It's profitable. Let's walk through this. Each round of war typically follows a familiar rhythm. Tensions rise, a triggering event occurs, often involving a killing, a raid, or a rocket, then the bombs fall. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza are reduced to rubble. Civilians, many of them children, are killed. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Power grids fail, and the international community briefly turns its gaze toward the region. But then, the cameras move on. And while civilians are burying their dead and digging through ruins, defense contractors are tallying their profits. Arms manufacturers see stock prices go up. Military technologies are battle-tested. Drones, missiles, and surveillance systems developed in Israel are then marketed globally as proven tools of counterterrorism. This isn't speculation, it's policy. Israel is one of the largest arms exporters in the world, and each war in Gaza becomes, in part, a live demonstration of its capabilities. Meanwhile, what happens inside Gaza? The humanitarian situation worsens, the blockade tightens, and the international aid machine kicks into gear again. Billions in donations flood in for reconstruction. But because of the blockade and the lack of sovereignty, much of that aid is funneled through a narrow set of approved channels, many of which reinforce the same power structures that helped cause the crisis in the first place. It's like rebuilding the prison after each fire, without ever questioning why the prisoners are still locked inside. And let's not forget the political gains. For leaders on both sides, war can be strangely convenient. Israeli politicians often see their approval ratings spike during military operations. Security becomes the central political message. In Gaza, Hamas uses war to strengthen its grip on power, presenting itself as the only group willing to resist. And in all of this, there's a silence, a deliberate silencing of moderate voices. Palestinians who advocate peaceful resistance, often jailed or discredited either by Hamas or by Israeli authorities. Israelis who speak out against occupation, labeled traitors or ignored by mainstream media. War drowns out the middle ground. It makes nuance impossible, and when peace doesn't pay, it's no surprise that it's treated like a fantasy. So who profits? Arms dealers, politicians, and power brokers. And who suffers? The civilians. Always the civilians. Mothers and fathers, farmers and teachers, children who have never known a day without drones buzzing overhead. This isn't just a tragedy. It's a structure, a system. And like any system, it doesn't change until enough people decide they've had enough. Some battles are fought with bullets, others with beliefs. And in the case of Israel and Palestine, one of the most powerful weapons of all is narrative. Let's start with this uncomfortable truth. Most people's understanding of the conflict comes not from first-hand experience, but from textbooks, news headlines, and social media. And these sources don't just report the facts, they shape them, edit them, reframe them, and sometimes erase them. Take school curricula, for example. In the West, many history books mention Israel's founding, but gloss over the Nakba. They present 1948 as a beginning, not a rupture, a triumph, not a trauma. Generations of students grow up with a one-sided version of history that makes the suffering of one group invisible. Meanwhile, in Palestinian classrooms, students are taught to remember the loss, the dispossession, the destruction of villages, but often without space to imagine what coexistence might look like beyond resistance. In both cases, complexity is sacrificed for simplicity, and humanity for identity. Now think about mainstream media. Headlines say conflict erupts or violence escalates, but rarely ask why those things erupted. Rarely mention the occupation, the blockade, the systemic inequality that precedes the violence. It's as if the story resets with every explosion. No backstory, no build-up, just boom. Then blame. This leads to a kind of collective amnesia, a forgetting that's not accidental. It's curated, selective, maintained. And when a narrative becomes this tightly controlled, questioning it starts to feel radical. Sharing statistics on civilian deaths or maps of lost Palestinian land gets labeled as bias. Asking about international law becomes controversial. And suddenly, simply remembering becomes a form of resistance. And here's something else to consider. The people who do remember, the survivors, the elders, the journalists who tell uncomfortable truths, they're aging. Many of the first-generation refugees from 1948 are gone. Their stories live on only if they're passed down. But when platforms censor voices, or when history is reduced to hashtags, that memory can vanish in a generation. This isn't just about the past. It's about control over the present, because whoever shapes the memory, shapes the moral framework, shapes who is seen as victim, who is seen as aggressor, who deserves empathy, and who does not. So when people say, it's too complicated, that's often because the full story has been fractured, intentionally. And if you can't access the whole history, how can you make sense of the present? This is why remembering matters, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, a tool to see clearly. Because without memory, there is no justice. And without truth, there is no peace. Let's step back for a moment. After all the wars, the peace talks, the occupations, the resistance, the aid, the walls, the bombs, what are we really looking at here? We're looking at a conflict frozen in time, a system so entrenched that it keeps repeating itself, not by accident, but by design. Power has been concentrated by states, by militaries, by global alliances, and by tightly controlled narratives. But when power is centralized like this, it doesn't just make decisions. It distorts incentives. It rewards escalation. It punishes compromise. It turns ordinary people into pawns, trapped between governments that claim to speak for them, but rarely listen to them. And this is the hidden thread running through it all. Because beneath the politics, beneath the ideology, there's a deeper question, one that haunts every empire, every occupation, every checkpoint and press release. What happens when human beings lose agency over their own lives? When their homes, their borders, even their history is controlled by someone else? You see, this isn't just about Israel or Palestine. It's about a larger pattern in human history, where centralized power, especially when backed by weapons and unchecked funding, tends to overwrite human dignity in the name of security, stability, or survival. But systems can't tell the truth. People can. That's why grassroots memory matters. That's why independent journalism matters. That's why decentralized voices, from local historians to everyday citizens, are often more truthful than the polished speeches of world leaders. Because those voices remember what gets left out. The children, the farmers, the markets, the melodies, the dreams. If there's a path forward, it won't come from the top down. It will come from those who refuse to let the past be rewritten or forgotten. Those who see beyond flags and factions. Who ask harder questions about justice, and who understand that peace is not the absence of war, it's the presence of freedom. So the question isn't just whose side are you on. The better question is, whose story are you willing to hear? If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more content that challenges the mainstream and dives deep into the stories buried beneath headlines. And if you want to keep uncovering the parts of history they don't want you to know, check out my book, history they tried to erase. The link is in the description. Because the past isn't over, it's being rewritten every single day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.